Have the Georgia Bulldogs completely broken the Auburn Tigers? That's the question that I have for you today. I think they have, and I'm going to explain why later in this video. But first, if you're talking Georgia-Auburn, you have to start from the very beginning. It's the Deep South's oldest rivalry. These two teams have played 127 times, and for at least the first 100 years, these two teams went back and forth. It was Georgia-Auburn, Georgia-Auburn. It was crazy how close these two teams were for the first 100 years. There's a reason why it's still considered to a lot of people one of the best rivalries in college football, but everything changed in the early 2000s when Mark Richt took over. Even though he lost to Auburn his first few years in Athens, I believe 01, 04, and 05, from 2006 on, I think Georgia's won 15 out of 18 games. I might be wrong there. Probably should have written that down. But yeah, they've lost to Auburn 3 times since 2006. And that game was big. Unranked Georgia had just lost to either Vanderbilt or Kentucky. Went into Jordan-Hare Stadium. Auburn was number 5, and Georgia whooped them up and down the field in the rain. Freshman Matthew Stafford was running wild on them. Big time game. And this game hasn't been the same since. Mark Richt really did change this series from back and forth, on and off, to where Georgia took command, and they've had a commanding lead in this series ever since. But when Kirby took over, that's when things really changed, and he has dominated Auburn. I think that's a fair word to use, dominated. He's only lost to Auburn once, and it was in 2017. But the other game in 2017 is what I'm trying to get to. That was the breaking point where Georgia essentially broke Auburn. 2017 SEC championship. You got to remember a few weeks before, Auburn beat Georgia down pretty good. They did beat Alabama, I think 2 weeks later, but they beat a really, really good Georgia team in Auburn. It was their Super Bowl. Those people were going absolutely bonkers. Fantastic scene. It was a great college football atmosphere, but that's about as good as it's been for Auburn in the last several years. But the morning of that SEC championship, that was the peak. That's as good as it has been for an Auburn fan going into that game against Georgia. Biggest game in the Georgia-Auburn rivalry in the entire series, over 100 years. This was the biggest Georgia-Auburn game, kind of by a mile. The winner was going to the playoff. And in Mercedes-Benz Stadium, Georgia beat them down pretty good, wore them down, and in the second half really took over and won that game 28-7. Georgia's won every game since, and they really haven't been that close. The 2019 game in Auburn, Georgia won just by 7 points, 21-14, but it was 21-0 at one point. That game was over. Auburn had a cute little comeback to try to make it a one-score game at the end of the game, but Georgia had that game won. And I don't want to say survived. They were clearly the better team, but that was as close as it's been recently. And Georgia's dominated this series. I don't think it'll ever be as close as it once was anymore. I said this in a video last year. Auburn will never tie the series ever again, and I don't mind doubling down on that. Georgia leads the series 63, 56, and 8. So yeah, that's about as large as a gap in the all-time series as we've ever seen. Auburn's not closing that. This series will never be tied again. That's a fact. It's not an opinion, unless Kirby Smart falls off the face of the earth and Hugh Freeze is the next Nick Saban. It's just not going to happen. I don't see a first-year head, Hugh Freeze, and an Auburn team beating Georgia in 2023. The last time they beat Georgia in Athens was 2005. Just, if you're watching this video, take a step back and try to remember what you were doing in 2005, where you were living. If you were going to school, did you have kids, whatever. I couldn't even drive. And I was 15 years old. That's how far it's been. And if they don't win in Athens in 24, it's going to be the 20-year mark, where 20 years have gone by where they have not won a game in Athens. It sounds crazy because, I grew up watching this game in the 90s and early 2000s, and they were always ranked, and the SEC East was up for grabs at this point in this season. The SEC West was up for grabs. This was before Nick Saban got to Alabama, and Auburn, was kind of having their way with the Tide here and there. But Massive wins. 02 was one of the biggest wins in Georgia football history. 2004, Auburn was one of the best teams in college football. I talked about the 2006 game, just shocking to everyone. 2007 was the blackout. The 2010 game with Cam Newton, the only time they've won a national championship in recent memory. The Nick Fairley game, so on and so on. So the moments are absolutely there, and it's tough because these games have not really been competitive, and I don't expect them to be for a while. And these two teams used to go after the same kids. The only two players that I can think of that Auburn beat Georgia out for, that Georgia won, was Owen Pappoe and Tank Bigsby. And at the end of the day, Georgia got the number one guy on their board, and that was Nakobe Dean. So losing Owen Pappoe to Auburn was not a big deal whatsoever. Really good player, and I think he would have done a great job at Georgia, but Georgia didn't need Owen Pappoe. Auburn did. Georgia had Nakobe Dean. So it's hard to say that they lost out to Auburn with Owen Pappoe, but Auburn has a roster full of guys who never had an offer from Georgia. So it's hard to imagine Auburn beating Georgia anytime soon. New head coach Hugh Freeze. It's going to take a few years for them to be in a position where they can compete and beat the likes of Georgia and Auburn. But ever since 2017, ever since that SEC championship, Georgia's program has been on the rise. Auburn's has been in decline. They fired Gus Malzahn, hired Brian Harsin, one of the most laughable hires I've ever seen doing this job, covering the Georgia Bulldogs, the SEC college football. When they hired Brian Harsin, I immediately knew that it was going to be a complete disaster. I was right. He did everything he could to run that program into the ground. Now they have Hugh Freeze, a guy who will do literally anything it takes to win. I don't want to go down the path of him as a person and what he's done previously as a head coach, whatever. But I thought it was a little surprising they went after Hugh Freeze with his background. But they will do anything it takes to win. This is a proud fan base that Auburn has, big fan base. They're proud. They want to win. They're tired of being the younger brother to Alabama and Georgia. They're ready to win. They want to win badly. And I thought they could have done a little better than Hugh Freeze myself. But I like the quarterback that they got, Walker White. And I picked up a commitment from him a couple days ago. Kid can play. I like what he brings to the table. So I do think they have a quarterback that can get them to a place where they can compete. But they're not going to be competing with Georgia or Alabama anytime soon. And again, it's crazy. But it's not crazy to the younger fans. If you're a young Georgia fan, all you know is Georgia consistently beating Auburn. With every once in a while, you have a game in 2010, 2013, and 2017. So every so often, Auburn will beat Georgia. But, you look at the schedule every year and you circle, okay, there's a win against Auburn. Whereas, when I was growing up and for the first 100 years of this game, that was a toss-up. Who's going to win, Georgia or Auburn? Georgia or Auburn? So I do think that Kirby and Georgia have kind of, I don't want to say ruined this rivalry because it's still there. There's still a lot of, there's hatred there. A lot of people say this is a brotherly type of deal. Pat Dye, coached at Auburn, played at Georgia. Vince Dooley played at Auburn, coached at Georgia. There's a lot of intermingling that's going on there. Very similar fan bases, but passionate. And the colors mesh. Like when you watch this game, especially when it was in November, it was a cold game. It was a sweater game, and the orange and blue going against the red and black. It just looked great. It looks like college football to me, and the rivalry just isn't the same. It's not the same anymore. Georgia has almost ruined this rivalry because they are consistently beating Auburn and doing it worse and worse every year. They won this game last year by 32 points. Before that, they won by 27. In 2020, they won by 21. In 18, they won by 17. In the SEC championship, they won by 21. So it's not like these games are close anymore. Georgia's taken the series, and they've run with it. It started with Mark Richt. It has continued with Kirby Smart. I don't see it stopping anytime soon. It's not the same anymore, whether you like it or not. Georgia is dominating Auburn. They've dominated the series. They're way up. Again, in the all-time lead, Georgia, again, 63, 56, and 8. They've won 6 in a row. Probably going to get to 10. I know I'm looking a little too far ahead in the future, years down the road, but they're not recruiting at the same level. They don't have the coaching staff. Georgia's deeper, talented. They've got the culture. within the program already set in stone. They've got the winning DNA, and Auburn has losing DNA right now. And I don't know if they're a program on the rise with Hugh Freeze. I think they're going to stay kind of where they are for a little bit. Not an impressive hire by any means. I don't think anyone is scared of Auburn now that Hugh Freeze is on board, but it's going to take a lot for them to get back to a place where they can beat Georgia every once in a while, because Georgia's won 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 out of 10. They'll run away with it. They're running away with the series, and I think Georgia really did break the Auburn Tigers after that 2017 SEC championship. Auburn hasn't been the same, and Georgia hasn't really been the same either, because they've been better, and they have really turned into a monster. And that game was, I think, one of the biggest reasons why. So I think the 2017 SEC championship game, biggest game in Georgia-Auburn history, is where Georgia broke the Auburn Tigers. What do you think? Drop a comment in the section below. Thanks for watching. We appreciate it, and I'll see you over on Dog Post.